Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, and thanks for stopping by again. Today I'd like to talk for a moment about stability, which is a word that is often associated with Panama. Is it stable? Why is it stable? And so forth. And in my experience, it most certainly is more stable than the great majority of Latin American nations, but also more so than much of North America and Europe these days, and in fact, most of the world. Why? How did this come about, and what helps to explain it, and how does it impact on you and your life living here? I think there are a number of reasons. People will often say something in the line, so common, it's probably the canal and the railroad before it, and they have a point. By virtue of having 150 years or 160 years of people from different countries passing through first the railroad, then the canal, Panamanians can deal with foreigners a lot more easily than a lot of other nations, where a sudden arrival of a lot of foreigners can be very, very, very upsetting to a society and destabilize it very quickly if it's something new and different. And that, I'm sure, was the case 160 years ago in Panama. But after all these decades of dealing with people from all over the world, that isn't going to be something that destabilizes the country in any serious manner. But I don't think that's really all that critical. I think the canal is used to explain a lot of things that sometimes it helps explain, but not as much as people like to think. I see two other factors as being very important here. One of those is geography. Panama is a small country, a very small country, one of the smallest in Latin America. And more than that, the bulk of the population lives in a relatively small portion of the nation, about half of it maybe, a little less than that. And that's basically from the Caribbean end of the Panama Canal, down that roughly 50 miles to Panama City. That's a north-south route. And then along the Inter-American Highway, west toward Costa Rica, until it gets to David, a city that many of you come thinking is pronounced David. It's David. In any event, along those roads that pass between Colón and Panama City, and the Inter-American that passes to the west, all the way to the border of Costa Rica, but certainly to David, and a few areas just off those roads, that's where 85% of the population live. And because it is also a small nation, it means that people can get on a bus, and for a few dollars, and within a few hours, they can be in Panama City. And then they can turn around and go back the same day if they want to. I mean, David is going to be maybe 6 hours away or something of this sort, depending on whether you've got an express bus or a local bus and so on. But it's entirely feasible to, if you wanted to get up and take an early bus to Panama City and get back in the same day. But of course, a lot of people don't live that far away, and so for them it's a 3-4 hour trip, and so they can come in the morning, be here in time for lunch, do some business, and turn around and go home while it's still light out. That's really very critical. And in addition, we have a great infrastructure, even though we complain about it steadily, and it's constantly being expanded as a result. Nonetheless, we have a very good road system that connects these areas of the country where the bulk of the population lives. Now, you go to another relatively small country, although they're larger than ours, Bolivia, Ecuador, Peru, these are Andean countries. Here you'll find that they may be small, but the infrastructure is nowhere near as good as it is here. And you have a division between people who live up high in the mountains and those that live down in the coast, or in Bolivia's case, those who live in the lowlands. And there's a long history of trouble and some often violence and so forth between the two groups of population, and misunderstanding, whatever, that leads to a lot of instability in these nations traditionally, and can still be the source of instability today. And Mexico, where the northern Mexico and the very southern end of it, bordering in Guatemala, are like two different worlds. Having a very small nation like Panama, and without having this huge mountain coast difference, generally speaking, the population is pretty much the same, ethnically, linguistically, and so forth, throughout this area where the great bulk of the population lives. And that is very helpful. So when they come into the city, it's nothing that unusual. It's easy to be done, and it's cheap, unlike many areas. Now, I've lived in a lot of nations where they're not that small, and for any of a number of reasons, bad infrastructure or simply the size of the nation, it's expensive, especially expensive, as well as time-consuming to go into the capital city. And what you end up with is large slums, often populated by people who came in from the countryside looking for jobs, looking for a better economy. And in these nations that are large, with sharp differences in whatever, the difference economically between the country and the capital city is gigantic. So that's where you go if you really want more money. They get there and then they can't make a go of it. There aren't enough jobs, or they don't have the right education, or one thing or another. They don't have enough money to go home. Saw that problem in the Philippines more than once when I lived there, but I've seen it in many other countries. So they're stuck, and they stay there, and they live in terrible slums, and they often get involved in crime, and the slums can overwhelm the center of the city in some circumstances if you don't watch out, if you don't have some economic growth. And that's a cause of a great deal of instability. Well, now in Panama it's very different. So it is that you're 16 years old and you probably have already been to the city, even if you live out in the country, but if you haven't, you can get on a bus, you can go into town. Because it's so nearby, you likely have family living in the city, and you visit them, and they take care of you while you're visiting, and you get around, you get to see things, you go out with your cousins and party or whatever. You get to know the city a little bit, then you get on a bus and go home. Or maybe your parents and family just pack things up and they come in, or they're living in the city and they come out to the countryside. So you have this movement back and forth between what would be considered the far end of the country, David, and here in Panama City, very easily done, much more so than is the case in most nations. And that has a huge impact, because then when your 18-year-old high school graduate decides, I'm going to go get a job in Panama City, she already knows the city. She's already been there more than once. She has relatives and family she can stay with there. And if things just simply don't work out, or she's unhappy or whatever, she can get on the bus and go home and be there the same day. It makes all the difference in the world. And it allows a lot of flexibility in people's lives. And it reduces the sharp division between the rural and urban people that you find in so many other nations. Now so I think geography has a major impact here, and is not appreciated enough. And I mentioned in there the fact that you come into town, you're also visiting family. Now family, again, I mentioned about that in another video on the middle class in Panama. It's just something that you always have to take into account when you're thinking of major social topics here in the country. And the truth of the matter is that families aren't all necessarily from the same economic background. I can tell you a little story. I have a friend here. I won't mention names, no embarrassment. He's very wealthy. He's a lot wealthier than I will ever be. Wonderful guy, a good friend, has a beautiful home and so on. And I was talking to him, this is some years ago, and I was dealing with a real estate agent at the time. And he said, who are you dealing with? And I told him, and she had the same last name, family name, as my friend. And he said, who's your father? And I said, I have no idea who her father is. He said, I said, I wonder, do you have her card? And I said, sure. And I gave him her card, and we went on with our conversation. Turns out later I discovered that no sooner had I left than he picked up the phone and he called her up. And he said, what part of the family are you from? And so on. And they talked and realized they were not closely, but they were related. They were in the same family, somewhat distantly, but the same family. So he said, come on over, we'll have lunch. So they sat and they talked about themselves and what they were doing. And here he is super wealthy. Here she is, I'd say lower middle class at that stage, aspiring, working to get up. Very different backgrounds, education completely different, financial situation completely different, but they're family. So they were sitting there talking, and I can assure you that he has business that she might be able to handle. He sends it to her. And if she comes across somebody who's looking for a lawyer in his specialty, where she'll suggest that client go and visit. this is incredibly important. It's the flow of information. The flow of information in Panama is especially good, although people can criticize it. We can criticize anything. But in 50 years of traveling all over the planet, the flow here is excellent between the rural and urban areas and within families, even when there are economic differences. Now, it may be that my wealthy friend, and when his family gets together, maybe she's not invited, but I wouldn't be surprised at all if she wasn't invited. I mean, that would be nothing shocking about that. But it may not be that they become that close, but they're connected now, and they do talk from time to time, and she will be remembered at Christmas time and so forth. This is really important. Information exchange up and down the income ladder, so to speak, as well as across the geography of the nation. It's casual. It's not being done for any purpose other than because, oh, well, it's easy to get to the city. It's easy to get to the country. He's a member of my family. She's a member of my family, and so on. Very, very natural. And yet it's all very helpful toward keeping that society stable, to help avoid this severe divisions that you get in other societies, where for geographical reasons, or just for class reasons, the differences are so huge that it can lead to violence. It can lead to all sorts of instability, and you don't want to live in an unstable country. I've done that. I tell you, it's a challenge, and it's really something you don't want to have to do unless you have to. But that's not the problem here. So it comes from all of that. How does it express itself? Now, in other words, I can say all this, and from anecdotal evidence, somebody I talked to, or an experience like the one I had here, and it's not the only experience of that kind that I've had, but it's really not enough, in my mind, to really settle it for me, although because of my past experience, it looked pretty obvious to me still. There's another factor involved, too. We have a polling firm, an opinion survey firm here that's been operating for more than a couple of decades. It's part of an international group of them. They're very well trained. I used them myself when I was first here to get an idea of how people vote in Panama. I've contracted well over 24 polls up in the United States, so I've worked with polling firms. I know how it operates and everything else. And this group has been very professional, and I was very pleased with the way they approached the work that they did for me. And every month they publish a report from a panel of 1,200 Panamanians from all different economic backgrounds in different parts of the country to get their opinions on a number of topics. This is wonderful, very interesting to me. So I download it every month. It's a free report. And what interests me is they divide it by, say, males and females. It's all in Spanish, of course. But that's interesting sometimes. Once in a while, they'll have a division between people who live in the Panama City area and people in the rural areas. For instance, a question on transportation recently. They divided because in the city, we have the metro, we have a modern bus system. They lack that, both out in the rural areas. So the question about the adequacy of transportation was, the results were divided between the two groups, and naturally the city people were much happier than the rural people are with their transportation system. But they also, on all the issues at least, they divide the respondents by economic class. I believe there are 5 of them, 5 or 6, from the upper end right down to very definitely working class, lower income people. And they give their responses to each of these questions by that income level. Now, I've seen that a lot in polls all over the world, not just the U.S., but I've seen them in other Latin American countries. I've seen them in Europe and Canada and all over. And it's not at all unusual, in certain issues at least, that lower income people have one opinion and the upper income people a very different opinion. And so as you work up the income ladder, so to speak, you have a change in how people feel about a particular topic. It doesn't happen all the time, but it happens quite often, and it's an indication to you of a division between the upper income and lower income. It doesn't come as a big surprise. And these particular surveys, though, time after time, the differences between the income groups are tiny. They're very small. And they don't always follow a logical pattern. I mean, maybe back and forth as they move up. It's not as if there's this, you look at it and there's no correlation. There's no way you can look at that and say, oh, upper income feel very strongly this way, and lower income feel very strongly that way, and the middle income people are in the middle. It doesn't work that way. It's remarkably similar between these different groups, and that is, to me, one of the most effective indicators that there is this flow of information that comes from people moving back and forth from one area to the other quite easily, especially in Panama. The most important difference is between Panama City, where half the population lives, and what we call the interior, the rest of the nation, where the other half live. The constant movement of people back and forth, and the family system, and its ability to work its way up and down the income ladder, and people getting to know each other and hearing each other's opinions. And then you see a survey come out, and you look at an issue where you'd expect potentially a substantial difference between rich people and poor people, and it isn't there. And there's a reason for that. And that's because they're basically in agreement. There may be a small difference, 3-4 percentage points, but that's nothing in the polling business, I can assure you. So, as far as I'm concerned, these two factors, the geography, the ease of the movement of information geographically and through class system, are critical aspects in maintaining the stability of Panama. And as long as they can maintain this, and I don't see any reason why they can't go on living as they've been living for so many years, they're going to be in a very good position. There are values, big values, to being in a small nation where you can move around very easily, and where families are still a strong system which can bring together people who may have very, very different backgrounds. The combination can be very, very useful, and I think it is here. So I believe that that's one of the reasons, or I should say two of the reasons, why stability is associated with Panama. I think they're real, and I'm very pleased that whatever the reasons are, that this nation is one of the most stable I've ever worked or lived in. Thank you. I look forward to seeing you again.